parts of Queens respectively, but all across the country. And we really appreciate the opportunity that we have each and every week as part of the Congressional Black Caucus's special order, this hour of power, to come before the people of this great country and speak directly to them for 60 minutes about an issue of great importance. We've heard a lot about the seminal nature of the Supreme Court's decision in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, an important decision striking down this principle of separate but equal, exposing it for the fraud that it was, recognizing that inherently this doctrine was just designed to hold up the notion of segregation in this country under a false premise that you can have institutions of learning that were separate but equal. Inherently, these institutions were unequal, as the Supreme Court found, and this reversed decades of Supreme Court jurisprudence that had been designed to uphold segregation and Jim Crow laws and racial hatred in America, first codified by the Supreme Court, we know, in 1857 in the infamous Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court and its Chief Justice held that blacks had no rights, whether they were free or whether they were slaves, that the white man was bound to respect. In this country, that's what the Supreme Court concluded in 1857. A war was fought as it relates to the conflict between the North and the South. Lives were lost, a lot of blood was spilled, and coming out of that conflict, of course, you had the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. But there was still a lot of people in America that didn't want to accept the notion of all men being created equally, as had been written in that glorious document, that Declaration of Independence. And so we got the black codes, and we got lynchings in the South, and we got Jim Crow segregation. And then again in 1896, the Supreme Court felt the need in Plessy versus Ferguson to step in and raise segregation up to the constitutional level and conclude in this Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, that separate but equal segregation was constitutional in the United States of America. And so the NAACP was subsequently formed in 1909, and some brilliant legal minds over time came together to help bring to life the democratic principles and ideals contained in the Constitution of the United States of America, but not actually practiced in this great country. Some of the names have already been called. Of course, Thurgood Marshall was the chief legal architect of the strategy that led to the dismantling of racial segregation in this country, but there were brilliant legal minds that he went out and recruited. Jack Greenberg and Constance Baker Motley, who went on to become a federal judge, and Robert Carter, who went on to become a federal judge, and Spotswood Robinson, who I believe went on to become a federal. Brilliant legal minds that came together, and in 1954, the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, thankfully, struck down this constitutionally upheld principle from Plessy versus Ferguson and decided that separate but equal was constitutionally suspect and shut it down. But then there were a lot of folks in America who still had to try to bring this principle to life. You had the desegregation struggles that took place all across the Deep South. James Meredith and the University of Mississippi in the early 1960s, and you had the Little Rock Nine who had to desegregate the Little Rock Central School District. These are brave individuals, young people confronted by angry mobs, bloodthirsty hounds, fire hoses, and all sorts of intolerable things here in America simply to get an education, and we know that education pays. And so we still have a long way to go. We've made a lot of progress, but I'm disturbed by the fact that I represent a congressional district in New York State, and that New York State is one of the most racially segregated schools in terms of its racial composition in the country. California is at the top of the list. Illinois is at the top of the list. Maryland is at the top of the list. And so we've got to deal with the continuation of this legacy, not because it's legally sanctioned at this point, but we still have far too many children educated in schools all across this country who are not being exposed to the diversity of this gorgeous mosaic that we have in America, and perhaps as a result of being isolated into schools with a high concentration of poverty, high concentration of racial minorities, that those schools don't necessarily have the same level of resources as we might find in other more affluent parts of America. And so we still have some barriers that we have to strike down. The road to equality in America is under construction. But I think we as members of the Congressional Black Caucus are hopeful, because we understand that if you trace the progress that has been made, we've come a long way over a pretty short period of time, yet we know we still have a long way to go. With that, I think I'll yield back, because I believe we've got another distinguished member of the CBC who's joined with us this evening.
I thank the co-anchor for yielding back time, and I'd like to extend time to the gentlelady from Texas. You just mentioned the fact that New York, California, and Texas lead this issue, and again, while we have made tremendous progress, as the UCLA study that was referenced by Representative Lee earlier this evening spoke about, students of color are much more likely to be grouped with their specific demographic. And so now, with the changing demographics, we're seeing a real increase and a striking finding among the segregation of Latino students. And so in New York, California, and Texas, more than half of all Latino students go to schools that are 90% minority or more. So to speak about that or other topics, let me yield time to Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas. Mr. Speaker, while she's coming, may I inquire on how much time we have remaining?
4 minutes.
Thank you.
Let me thank the gentleman very much for his leadership on this very important opportunity to discuss equality in America, and joined by his colleague and our colleague, Mr. Jeffries of New York, and of course our Chairwoman Fudge. We have led on issues, topical issues, but painful issues, issues that are important not only to the people of color, but certainly to people around the nation, and I might say as they look upon the United States as a beacon of light to people around the world. It's often when I travel internationally that I will hear people speak of the work that we do in the floor of the House. So I too come to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education and remind my colleagues that some 60 years ago, the Supreme Court unlocked the schoolhouse doors, broke down yet another barrier to equality, and beat the long arc of moral history toward justice. But we come now 60 years later, and I just want to speak of a few points, for many of my colleagues have already been on the floor of the House, but I wanted to express some of the consternations that really unwind, if you will, the goodness of the Warren Court and its efforts to make a difference in the lives of so many Americans. Let me just read these words that were in Newsweek 60 years ago about this decision. It was the most momentous court decision in the whole history of the Negro struggle